Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Robert from El Magnifico Games, and today we are going to continue our poetry, prose, and riddles stream. So, starting with the poetry. Last week we finished on the poem "Say Not the Struggle Naught Availeth" by Arthur Hugh Clough. I assume that's how his surname's pronounced. I must admit, I have forgotten. Anyway, as usual, we will start by reading the last poem we finished the week before, and then we'll move on. So, say not the struggle naught availeth, the labour and the wounds are vain, the enemy faints not nor faileth, and as things have been they remain. If hopes were dupes, fears may be liars. It may be, in yon smoke concealed, your comrades chase even now the flyers, and, but for you, possess the field. For while the tired waves, vainly breaking, seem here no painful inch to gain, far back, through creeks and inlets making, comes silent, flooding in the main. And not by eastern windows only, when daylight comes in the light. In front the sun climbs slow, how slowly, but westward look, the land is bright. I must say, upon rereading this, I think I've understood a little bit more than I did at the end of during last week's stream. In particular, I think the last paragraph is making more sense to me now. I think what it's saying is that I think daylight is being used as a metaphor for good things, for good triumphing, that sort of idea. And the point they're making is that light can come in. Well, literally speaking, daylight can come in from more directions than directly from the sun, whereas the metaphor is saying that good things can happen in indirect ways. So if the metaphor of the light from the sun bouncing off the land to the west and then in through the window, so they're suggesting that good things may come in unexpected ways, I think. It's a nice little poem. Anyway, that was last week. We are now moving on to Samuel Taylor at Coleridge, Youth and Age. No, I do apologise. This was the last poem we finished on. That was my mistake. My apologies. I will reread this one, and then we will move on. Verse: a breeze mid blossoms straying, where hope clung feeding like a bee. Both were mine, life went a-maying, with nature, hope and poesy. Sorry, I'm gonna double check I am pronouncing that word correctly, and then I will begin this rereading anew. Unfortunately, I don't think you've caught me at my best today. poesy, I think. My IPA is not brilliant. Anyway, my apologies for all these mistakes and delays. Once again, Youth and Age by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Verse, a breeze mid blossoms straying, where hope clung feeding like a bee. Both were mine, life went a-maying, with nature, hope and poesy, when I was young. When I was young, ah, woeful when, for the change twixt now and then. This breathing house not built with hands, this body that does me grievous wrong. Over airy cliffs and glittering sands, how lightly when it flashed along, like those trim skiffs unknown of yore, on winding lakes and rivers wide, that ask no aid of sail or oar, that fear no spite of wind or tide, nor cared this body for wind or weather. When youth and I lived in it together, flowers are lovely, love is flower-like, friendship is a sheltering tree. Oh, the joys that came down shower-like, of friendship, love and liberty, ere I was old. Ah, woeful ere, which tells me youth's no longer here. O youth, for years so many and sweet, 'tis known that thou and I were one. I'll think it but a fond conceit, it cannot be that thou art gone. Thy vesper bell hath not yet told, and thou wert I a masker bold. What a strange disguise hast now put on, to make believe that thou art gone. I see these locks in silver slips, this drooping gait, this altered size, but springtide blossoms on thy lips, and tears take sunshine from thine eyes. Life is but a thought, so think I will, that youth and I are housemates still. Dewdrops are the gems of morning, but the tears of mournful eve. Where no hope is, life's a warning, that only serves to make us grieve when we are old. That only serves to make us grieve, with often tedious taking leave, like some poor nigh related guest, that may not rudely be dismissed, yet have outstayed his welcome while, and tells the jest without the smile. Nice, but quite challenging. Hello, Mindful. How are you? So, that was the one we finished off on last week. We are now moving on to William Collins, and it looks like they only have a single poem from this author. So, let's briefly look up who he was. Excellent. I'll do my best. So, William Collins, 1721 to 1759, was an English poet. So that makes him Georgian. Second in influence only to Thomas Gray, he was an important poet of the middle decades of the 18th century. His lyrical odes mark a progression from the Augustan poetry of Alexander Pope's generation and towards the imaginative ideal of the Romantic era. Although it's worth noting that he is clearly pre-Romantic. If I recall correctly, it was Robert Burns who really spurred the Romantic movement on. Yes. And he was in fact born the year that William Collins died. Son of a hat maker and former mayor of the town. Interesting. failing to obtain a university fellowship, being judged by a military uncle as too indolent even for the army, and having rejected the idea of becoming a clergyman, he set out for a literary career and was supported in London by a small allowance from his cousin. Following the failure of his collection of odes, aggravated by drunkenness, so unsettled his mind that he eventually sank into insanity, and by 1754 was confined to MacDonald's madhouse in Chelsea. Goodness gracious. From there he moved to the care of an elder sister in Chichester, who lived with her clergyman husband within the cathedral precincts. There Collins continued to stay, with periods of lucidity during which he was visited by the Wharton brothers. On his death in 1759 he was buried in St Andrews in the Oxmarket Church. Died aged 37. Poor chap. I mean, usually I go through these Wikipedia articles briefly in the hopes that we might learn something which is relevant to the poetry, like why they chose a particular subject matter. Did it have some sort of personal significance to them or something like that? But yeah, so you see, he does seem to have quite an extraordinary and unfortunate life. Still, the poem appears to be entitled in this anthology, written in the year 1746, so I would assume they don't actually know the title of the poem, or it has no title, and it's a short one. So, I will begin. How sleep the brave who sink to rest, by all their countries wished blessed. When spring with dewy fingers cold returns to deck their hallowed mould, she there shall dress a sweeter sod than fancy's feet have ever trod. By fairy hands their knell is rung, by forms unseen their dirge is sung. Their honour comes a pilgrim grey to bless the turf that wraps their clay, and freedom shall a while repair to dwell a weeping hermit there. Yes, I fear I'm going to have to look up a few words here to double check. So, how sleep the brave who sink to rest, by all their country's wishes blessed. So that might be a reference to fallen soldiers. When spring with dewy fingers cold returns to deck their hallowed mould. Well, hallowed is holy. What do they mean by mould in this context? Oh, Mind said being supported by others, poor mental health. Yep, that's an artist, alright, rest in peace. Yes, poor chap. Apparently, mould can mean loose soil. To cover with... Oh, mould! Ah! Oh, that's interesting. Loose, friable soil, rich in humus and fit for planting. Ah! I wonder how that... I wonder if that's related to the usage, meaning fungi. Yes, I'd assume they mean grave. Earth, ground. Oh no, it looks like it just comes from Proto-Germanic meaning dirt or soil. Okay. I don't think I was familiar with that usage, but that makes sense. So returns to deck their hallowed mould, so presumably their grave. She there shall dress a sweeter sod than fancy's feet have ever trod. Okay, so sod as in earth. So spring is going to dress this earth, as in their grave, than fancy's feet have ever trod. Obviously you tread on ground, and fancy here, what would they mean by fancy as a personification, as an individual? Oh, imagination, of course, as in fantasy. Slightly embarrassing I didn't make the connection. Okay, so they're describing the earth of what we assume to be the grave as being sweeter than anything that imagination has ever trod, so the most perfect, one would assume. By fairy hands their knell is rung. Okay, knell. To ring a bell slowly, especially for a funeral, to toll. To signal or proclaim something. To summon by, or as if by ringing a bell. Or the sound of a bell knelling, a toll. Okay. By fairy hands their knell is rung. So, a funeral toll, presumably. By forms unseen, their dirge is sung. A dirge is a funeral song. So yes, we're definitely getting strong connotations of the grave here. Their honour comes, a pilgrim grey, to bless the turf that wraps their clay. I feel like a pilgrim grey is probably a very specific reference that I just don't know, and probably wouldn't have much luck looking up. There probably is a grey figure that's associated with graves that they would have known, and I don't. Unless they're just referring to family members dressed in drab clothing, because of course, at least as far as funerals themselves are concerned, it's considered in very poor taste to wear bright colourful clothing. You're expected to wear blacks and greys and so on. Perhaps the same is true, or was true, when visiting graves. So this could be a family member or friend, I would guess. And clay, I assume, is a polite metaphor for their remains. And freedom shall a while repair to dwell a weeping hermit there. So repair in this context presumably means to, what's the word? To retire, or to rest. I'm fairly certain that's one of the meanings of repair. Yes, annual repair to the mountains. So freedom shall a while repair to dwell a weeping hermit there. So the weeping hermit, I would assume, is a loved one who is visiting the grave. But what do I mean, freedom shall repair? Because they're referring to them as a hermit, I wonder if they're just describing someone that stays there for a long period of time, and the lack of freedom is just by analogy to a hermit who, by virtue of the fact that they shun not ordinary life, they don't have a lot of freedom. Or possibly there's something more complex going on there that I don't understand. Mindful says, I think it's saying the honour itself is a pilgrim grey. Yes, I think you're right, actually. Their honour comes a pilgrim grey to bless the turf that wraps their clay. I think you're correct. And freedom shall a while repair to dwell a weeping hermit there. And freedom is the hermit. Freedom is the weeping hermit. So freedom as a personification, as an individual, the idea of freedom as an individual takes a break to weep there. So although there is no specific reference to war or anything like that, due to the references to bravery and their country's wishes and honour and freedom, I am guessing that this is a poem about a dead soldier, someone that gave their life for their country, for honour and for freedom. Mindful says, like the honour of death for country has come to make their grave a more hallowed thing. Yes, I think you're right. So looking at this more rhythmically, I think there's 8 syllables per line. And there is a tendency for the second syllable in each pair to be stressed, although not exclusively. I mean, the first line's a very good example. How sleep the brave who sink to rest. That very much does have a da-dun, 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 da-dun rhythm. So that is, if I recall correctly, that's iambic. Let me double check that, yep. But there's 4 pairs of syllables, so that's going to be iambic tetrameter, is it? I think. I think they've actually done a pretty good job of keeping the meter as well. This is actually quite surprising because... So, I should point out, I'm not particularly knowledgeable when it comes to poems. This whole stream has been very educational for me on the topic. But one thing that I've been trying to look out from the very beginning is for the poetic forms, the meter of the poems. Because I may not know a lot about it, but I do know it's important, and very few of the poems I have actually read have had a consistent meter. Either that, or I just haven't been able to find the meter. That's always a possibility. But this poem does seem to have a consistent meter, and obviously makes sense, and is quite beautiful in its way. So I'm genuinely quite impressed. So, I will give this one more reading. While I'm doing that, if there's any further questions anyone has about this poem that they want us to look at, or anything else, any other aspect of this poem that you think's undiscussed, pop them in chat. I will then read it after I've finished rereading this poem, and then once anything additional has been addressed, then we'll move on to the next poem. Mindful just asked me, do you tend to favour metered rhyming poetry? I think that the metering and the rhyming is probably less important than how well it gets across than how it's otherwise compelling. I think a poem can be very compelling without rhyming or using meter, but I also think that rhyming and meter will add to it if you can pull it off. Now, if I go back up, there was a poem a few weeks ago, or a week or two ago, yes, there was a poem a few weeks ago that we looked at, which I thought was particularly interesting, because it didn't seem to have a consistent meter, but aside from that, it had rhyming, but they kept on changing the rhyming scheme. So if I quickly reread this one, this is "Oh Snatched Away in Beauty's Bloom," which was by Lord Byron, if I recall correctly. Yes, it was. "Oh snatched away in beauty's bloom, on thee shall press no ponderous tomb, but on thy turf shall roses rear their leaves the earliest of the year, and the wild cypress wave in tender gloom, and oft by yon blue gushing stream shall sorrow lean her drooping head, and feed deep thought with many a dream, and lingering pause and lightly tread, fond wretch, as if her step disturbed the dead. Away! We know that tears are vain, that deaf nor heeds nor hears distress. Will this unteach us to complain, or make one mourner weep the less? And thou, who tell'st me to forget, thy looks are wan, thine eyes are wet." Now, the thing that I thought was really interesting was in the first paragraph we see bloom and tomb rhyme, and rear and year rhyme, and gloom rhymes with bloom and tomb. So you have a sort of A, B, B, A rhyming scheme. Then in the next one we have stream and dream, head and tread and dead. So now we've got A, B, B, and finally we have vain, complain, distress less, and forget wet. So here we have yet another rhyming scheme. We have an A, B, C, C. That I thought was particularly interesting because it doesn't have a consistent meter, it doesn't have a consistent rhyming scheme, but it does rhyme, which allows it to still have interesting sound to it without being so restrictive. So in answer to your question, do you tend to favour metered rhyming poetry? I suppose what I would say is, when someone can pull it off, I really appreciate that they've done so, like I do here. I find it impressive. That doesn't necessarily mean that the poems I like the most always rhyme or are always metered, or that I suppose the other point that I was trying to make with the poem I just went back up to is that it's also more of a sliding scale. It's not as simple as does it rhyme or doesn't it rhyme, because of course you can have it rhyme some of the time and not all of the time and so on. So I suppose yes, I favour it, but I don't consider it essential. There, that's a very long answer to a very simple question. So I will reread this one once, and then if you have any further questions, drop them into chat. So, how sleep the brave who sink to rest, by all their country's wishes blessed, when spring with dewy fingers cold returns to deck their hallowed mould. She there shall dress a sweeter sod than fancy's feet have ever trod. By fairy hands their knell is rung, by forms unseen their dirge is sung, their honour comes, a pilgrim grey, to bless the turf that wraps their clay, and freedom shall a while repair, to dwell a weeping hermit there. Oh, I'm sorry to hear about your connection issues. If there's anything you'd like me to repeat, let me know. So, if there's no further questions about this one, then I will move on to the next poem. Well, of course, I can begin looking up the next poet, and if there are any further questions, then I can go back. So, William Cowper. William Cowper was an English poet and hymn writer. One of the most popular poets of his time, Cowper changed the direction of 18th century nature poetry by writing of everyday life and scenes of the English countryside. In many ways, he was one of the forerunners of the romantic poetry. Samuel Taylor Coleridge called him the best modern poet, while William Wordsworth particularly admired his poem Yardley Oak. After being institutionalized for insanity, Cowper found refuge in a fervent evangelical Christianity. He continued to suffer doubt, and after a dream in 1773 believed that he was doomed to eternal damnation. He recovered and wrote more religious hymns. His religious sentiment and association with John Newton, who wrote the hymn Amazing Grace, led to much of the poetry for which he is best remembered, and to the series Omni Hymns. His poem Light Shining Out of Darkness gave English the phrase God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He also wrote a number of anti-slavery poems, and his friendship with Newton, who was an avid anti-slavery campaigner, resulted in Cowper being asked to write in support of the abolition campaign. Cowper wrote a poem called The Negro's Complaint, which rapidly became very famous and was often quoted by Martin Luther King Jr. during the 20th century civil rights movement. He also wrote several other well-known poems on slavery in the 1780s, many of which attacked the idea that slavery was economically viable. Welcome back, Mindful. So I had just finished wrapping up this poem. If you do have any further questions about it, or want me to repeat anything I said before, let me know. And I hadn't yet read this poem. I was looking up the poet. Apparently, William Cowper also suffered from mental health issues, which is an unexpected theme this afternoon, it would seem. So, this is called To a Young Lady, this poem. Sweet stream that winds through yonder glade, apt emblem of a virtuous maid, silent and chaste she steals along, far from the world's gay busy throng, with gentle yet prevailing force, intent upon her destined course. Graceful and useful all she does, blessing and blessed wherever she goes, pure bosomed as that watery glass, and heaven reflected in her face. I do apologise, particularly towards the end. That wasn't a very good reading. Well, I think this certainly reflects his fervent evangelical Christian bent that was described. So, I don't think there were any words this time that I didn't follow. If there's any words that anyone else would like to have looked up, let me know, or explained. So, sweet stream that winds through yonder glade, apt emblem of a virtuous maid. So that's in a very overt way, drawing an analogy between something in nature and, well, the one of the cultural ideals of young women at the time. Silent and chaste she steals along, far from the world's gay busy throng. I wonder in what sense he's considering the stream to be chaste. I suppose because it's pure clean water? With gentle yet prevailing force, intent upon her destined course. Graceful and useful all she does, blessing and blessed wherever she goes. Pure bosomed as that watery glass, and heaven reflected in her face. I'm guessing the watery glass is the stream's surface. Some very nice metaphors here. Rhythm, right. Most of the lines seem to be 8 syllables, but I'm fairly certain that a few of them were 9. I don't think there's a proper meter here though, because if you take the second line, for example, apt emblem of a virtuous maid, I don't think you would, I could be wrong, I don't think you'd get of and a together in a poem with meter, with an even number of syllables, so there are some poetic meters that work in pairs of syllables, and there are some that work in triplets of syllables. Because most of these lines have 8 syllables, it seems, we can rule out there being any set of free meters at work here. So we're down to the pairs of syllables, and I don't think you'd get of and a next to each other with such a meter, because this clearly isn't going to be a meter where every syllable is unstressed or every syllable is stressed. I know those meters exist and have names, but that clearly isn't what this poem is, and you wouldn't usually stress either of or a. So unless I'm fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of poetic meter, which is possible, I think just the presence of and a next to each other means we can rule out there being any consistent meter in this poem. Mindful says, I actually love poems to lean hard into one particular metaphor or of imagery. This one seems to be a steady stream. Yes. I'm not sure if you were here when I was reading through William Cowper's Wikipedia page, but they do point out that he was... where was it? He changed the direction of 18th century nature poetry by writing of everyday life and scenes of the English countryside. So, that figures. But yes, metaphors can add a lot. And this is this poem itself is very visual. A bit, what's the word? A bit idealistic. It's hard to imagine that this poem describes a real person and all their complexity. But still, very nice imagery. So, it seems that there is no consistent meter, unless I've made a mistake. There's no difficult words that I noticed. So, I guess I will give the final reading of this poem. Again, if you have any questions or anything you'd like to discuss about this poem, put them to just pop them into chat and I'll read them when I've finished rereading this. And then after that, anything like that's been addressed, we'll move on. So, to a young lady. Sweet stream that winds through yonder glade, apt emblem of a virtuous maid, silent and chaste she steals along, far from the world's gay busy throng, with gentle yet prevailing force, intent upon her destined course, graceful and useful all she does, blessing and blessed wherever she goes, pure bosomed as that watery glass, and heaven reflected in her face. Oh, of course, I didn't address any rhyming. We seem to have an AABB CC rhyme, although glass and face don't rhyme. That's interesting. Is it possible that the way they would have been pronounced at the time they would have rhymed? Or was that deliberate? Perhaps it's supposed to be watery glace. I don't know. Anyway, let's move on, assuming there's nothing more to discuss. So, Alan Cunningham. Oh, which one do you think's a sonnet? This one? I assume Alan... This is the one we're looking. I assume this is the same author. Was a Scottish poet and author. Life. He was born at Keir, near Dalswinton, Dumfries and Galloway. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, incidentally. And first worked as a stonemason's apprentice. His father was a neighbour of Robert Burns at Ellisland, and Alan with his brothers James visited James Hogg, the Ettrick shepherd, who became a friend to both. Cunningham's other brothers were the naval surgeon Peter Miller Cunningham and the poet Thomas Maunsey Cunningham. Cunningham gave his leisure to reading and writing imitations of old Scottish ballads. In 1809 he collected old ballads for Robert Hartley Cromek's Remains of Nithsdale and Galloway Song. He sent in, however, poems of his own, which the editor inserted, even though he may have suspected their real authorship. It gained for him the friendship of Walter Scott and James Hogg. In 1810, Cunningham went to London, where he worked as a parliamentary reporter and journalist till 1814, when he became clerk of the works in the studio of the sculptor Francis Chantry, a post he kept until Chantry's death in 1841. Interesting. So, led a very different life to the other two poets we've looked at today. Oh, sorry. Mindful just said no to a young lady. I think it might be a sonnet, but I couldn't recall what kind. No big deal. Oh, okay. What is the definition of a sonnet? A sonnet is a poetic form which originated in the Italian poetry. The term sonnet is derived from the Italian word sonetto, little song. English. Prosodically, Surrey is more adept at composing in iambic pentameter, and his sonnets are written in what has come to be known anachronistically as Shakespearean measure. This version of the sonnet form, characterized by three alternately rhymed quatrains terminating in a final couplet: A B A B C D C D E F E F G G. Became the favourite during Elizabethan times, when it was widely used. Okay, so the sonnet, presumably... Okay, that's very interesting. So being a sonnet, then is supposed to... Yeah, I think this then suggests that a sonnet only mandates a specific rhyming structure. Although it talks about, for example, Surrey is more adept at composing in iambic pentameter, presumably sonnets don't have to be written iambic pentameter? Or do they? Well, there's no way that that's iambic pentameter, because the first line has 8 syllables. And as I said before, I don't think it can be iambic because we've got of and a next to each other. Which of those would you stress? You wouldn't want to stress either of them. But yes, I think you're probably right. I think it is a sonnet. I think it's a sonnet with a slightly relaxed rhythmic structure. But I'm no expert. I could be wrong. Thank you for your insight, though. So, we were looking at Alan Cunningham, who was a Scottish poet who... So, he was born Georgian and died Victorian, I believe. I always forget when Queen Victoria came onto the throne. I looked this up last week as well. In 1837. Yeah, so he lived most of his life as a Georgian. Mindful says, yeah, it's... I assume this is in reference to the previous poem, I should point out. Mindful says, yeah, it's kind of close but not really, just reminded me of it, I guess. Mostly the unique rhyming couplet at the end. No, I think that was a very astute observation. I think you're right that is in fact a sonnet. It's interesting. Both interesting the structure they were trying to fit the poem to, but also the ways in which they relaxed it. So, A Wet Sheet and a Flowing Sea, Alan Cunningham. A wet sheet and a flowing sea, a wind that follows fast, and fills the white and rustling sail, and bends a gallant mast. And bends a gallant mast, my boys, while like the eagle free, away the good ship flies and leaves old England on the lee. Oh, for a soft and gentle wind, I heard a fair one cry, but give to me the snoring breeze, and white waves heaving high. And white waves heaving high, my boys, the good ship tight and free, the world of waters is our home, and merry men are we. There's tempest in yon horned moon, and lightning in yon cloud, and hark the music, mariners, the wind is piping loud. The wind is piping loud, my boys, the lightning flashing free, while the hollow oak our palace is, our heritage the sea. Ah, that was the only one. From this particular... in this anthology from this particular author. I do remember they mentioned that one of his brothers was a naval surgeon, so I imagine that may have been an influence in him writing a poem about being on a ship at sea. Right, and leaves old England on the lee. What is a lee? A protected cove or harbour, out of the wind, the side of the ship away from the wind. So presumably the first one. A sheltered place, especially a place protected from the wind by some object, the side sheltered from the wind. See also lee side, shelter protection. Interesting. So, where it says, away the good ship flies and leaves old England on the lee, presumably they mean it leaves England from a point of protection, like a protected cove or harbour. I assume. Right, are there any more words that need looking up? I'm not sure what they mean by a horned moon. I'm a bit dubious as to whether I will find a good explanation on Wiktionary, but we can look. Rare of the moon, in its crescent phase, waxing or waning. Wow. That serves me right for doubting Wiktionary. I think that was all the words that needed to be looked up. If there's anything else, any other words that anyone would like looked up or explained, just let me know in chat. Oh, I'm glad you enjoy it, Mindful. So, as far as rhyming structure is concerned, it appears to have a B, C, B repeating structure. So the first and the third lines do not rhyme, but each second and fourth lines do. So sea and sail don't, fast and mass do. Boys and leaves don't, free and lee do. And meter. Okay, so I noticed that it looks like every odd numbered line has 8 syllables and every even numbered line has 6. Which explains why you end up with this structure down here where it's and white waves heaving high and white waves heaving high, my boys. So I don't think that's consistent with any particular meter, but it's certainly got I don't think it's consistent with a recognised meter, but I could be wrong, because I'm not knowledgeable in this area, but it certainly would have a certain rhythm to it. It would have a certain auditory effect. Yes, I quite like it. Not much, I don't think there's much more to discuss. So I will head on to the final reading of this one. Again, if there's anything else you'd like to discuss about this poem, pop it into chat and I will look at it after I have finished giving the final reading. A wet sheet and a flowing sea, a wind that follows fast, and fills the white and rustling sail, and bends the gallant mast. And bends the gallant mast, my boys, while like the eagle free, away the good ship flies and leaves old England on the lee. Oh, for a soft and gentle wind, I heard a fair one cry, but give to me the snoring breeze, and white waves heaving high. And white waves and white waves heaving high, my boys, the good ship tight and free. The world of waters is our home, and merry men are we. There's tempest in yon horned moon, and lightning in yon cloud, and hark the music, mariners, the wind is piping loud. The wind is piping loud, my boys, the lightning flashing free, while the hollow oak our palace is, our heritage the sea. Mindful says, just a fun, straightforward shanty. Yes, I should think so. Apologies, I know that reading wasn't the best. And we're on to yet another poet. Earlier on, while we were working through this anthology, we often would have quite a few poems, all from the same poet, but we seem to have reached a part of this book in which they are focusing on individual poems from... They seem to have chosen individual poems from poets to thus covering a greater number of poets, it would seem. So, William Davenant. Oh, blimey. This is earlier, 1606 to 1668. I wonder if this is the same person. Also spelled Davenant. Was an English poet and playwright. Along with Thomas Killigrew, Davenant was of the rare figures in English Renaissance theatre whose career spanned both the Caroline and Restoration eras, and was active both before and after the English Civil War and during the interregnum. That is remarkable. Unfortunately, there's rather more biography here than I should probably stop to read out. His godfather sometimes being said to have been William Shakespeare. It has also been suggested that Davenant simply meant that he saw himself as a literary son of Shakespeare, in the same way that followers of Ben Jonson called themselves the sons of Ben. He attended Lincoln College, Oxford for a while, in about 1620, but left before gaining any degree, becoming a page to the Duchess of Richmond. In London in 1630, he contracted a venereal disease and was given a syphilis treatment by Thomas Cadman. As a convalescent, he left for the country in 1632 for a time. The syphilis severely disfigured his nose, resulting in damage that is discreetly depicted in John Greenhill's portrait. His ruined nose was the subject of much ribald comment by his enemies. Following the death of Ben Jonson in 1637, Davenant was named Poet Laureate in 1638. He was a supporter of King Charles I in the English Civil War. In 1641, before the war began, he was declared guilty of high treason by Parliament along with John Suckling after he participated in the First Army Plot, a royalist plan to use the army to occupy London. He fled to France. Returning to join the King's army when the war started, he was knighted 2 years later by King Charles following the siege of Gloucestershire. The siege of Gloucester. In 1645, after the Royalist defeat at the Battle of Naseby, he retired to Paris, where he became a Roman Catholic and worked on his epic poem, Gondibert. That same year he was appointed emissary to France, and in 1649 was given the symbolic post of treasurer of the colony of Virginia by the exiled Charles II. The following year he was made a lieutenant governor of Maryland, but was captured at sea, imprisoned and sentenced to death. In July 1650 he was put on trial for his life along with others in front of the newly established High Court of Justice. He is said to have been saved by the intervention of John Milton. He spent all of 1651 in the Tower of London, where he continued writing Gondibert. On his release in 1652 he immediately published Gondibert, but he was only pardoned in 1654 in order to avoid the strict laws of censorship in force in all public places at the time. He turned a room of his house, Rutland House, into a private theatre where his works and those of other writers considered seditious could be performed. Performance of his The Siege of Rhodes at Rutland House in 1656 is considered to be the first performance of an English opera, and also included England's first known professional actress, Mrs. Coleman. Davenant once again found himself in legal trouble in 1659 when he was imprisoned for his part in Sir George Booth's uprising in Cheshire after the death of Cromwell. He was, however, released the same year and left once more for France when Charles II was restored to the throne. Davenant returned to England. The restoration also led to the reopening of theatres, which had been closed due to the influence of the Puritans under Cromwell. In 1660 he is publicly recorded as being one of the two theatrical patentes, along with Thomas Killigrew, who obtained a monopoly of public theatre performances. He headed the Duke of York's men and produced highly successful theatrical seasons at Lincoln's Inn Fields from 1660 until his death in 1668. So he had quite an eventful life, it would seem. Assuming this is the same individual. Well, it must be, mustn't it? Surely. And this piece appears to be entitled Song. So I'm guessing either they didn't know the title of this piece, or perhaps it's an extract from a larger work, I'm not sure. The lark now leaves his watery nest, and climbing shakes his dewy wings. He takes his window for the east, and to implore your light he sings. Awake, awake, the morn will never rise, till she can dress her beauty at your eyes. The merchant bows unto the seaman's star, the ploughman from the sun his season takes, but still the lover wonders what they are, who look for day before his mistress wakes. Awake, awake, break through your veils of lawn, then draw your curtains and begin the dawn. I wonder what they mean by lawn. A type of thin linen or cotton? That seems very likely. I suspect that's what it is. That's really quite nice, isn't it? So as far as rhyming is concerned, the second and fourth lines rhyme, and the fifth and sixth lines rhyme in both paragraphs. The first and third do not. I don't think there's a consistent meter here. There's a tendency, though, I think, for there to be 8 syllables per line, and the second syllable, and each second syllable to be stressed. So it's almost like it's a broken iambic tetrameter. But take, for example, awake, awake, the morn will never rise. That's 9 syllables. Sorry, 10. Oh, so's the following line. Oh, so I wonder if it's 8, 8, 8, 8, 10, 10. No, because we've got 10 on the next line as well. As in the first line of the second paragraph. So a better counterexample then would be the fourth line of the second paragraph, and to implore your light he sings. In normal spoken English, I'm fairly certain you would not stress either of and or to. So it's a broken... So I think there is a strong tendency towards it being iambic. That is, that the first syllable in any pair is weak and the second is strong. But he varies the number of syllables per line quite freely. And in some cases, drops the iambic structure, presumably because he couldn't otherwise say what he wants to say. It's good though. So the lark now leaves his watery nest and climbing shakes his dewy wings. That's fairly self-explanatory and some quite beautiful imagery. He takes this window for the east, and to implore your light he sings. Again, very beautiful imagery. Awake, awake, the morn will never rise till she can dress a beauty at your eyes. So again, this is now bringing in the real subject of the poem, which is presumably the beauty of a woman that the male that the person being talked to in the poem, who is presumably male, is observing. The merchant bows unto the seaman's star, the ploughman from the sun his season takes. So, what causes people to... So, a description of why people of different professions rise at different times, but still the lover wonders what they are, who look for day before his mistress wakes. So, some Quite beautiful romantic lines there. Awake, awake, break through your veils of lawn, then draw your curtains and begin the dawn. So, fairly self-explanatory. Still very, very nice, I think. So, if there's any more questions about this poem, pop them into chat. I will begin the final reading now, and then I think we will move on to Pride and Prejudice. The lark now leaves his watery nest, and climbing shakes his dewy wings. He takes his window for the east, and to implore your light he sings. Awake, awake, the morn will never rise, till she can dress her beauty at your eyes. The merchant bows unto the seaman's star, the ploughman from the sun his season takes, but still the lover wonders what they are, who look for day before his mistress wakes. Awake, awake, break through your veils of lawn, then draw your curtains and begin the dawn. That's not a problem, Mindful. I am very sympathetic to the problems you're having. I should... Yeah, if anyone else is having similar troubles, let me know. But yes, I really like this poem. So, are there any more questions about this, or I suppose any of the other poetry we've looked at? And if not, we will move on to Pride and Prejudice. Okay, I'll assume that there's nothing more to discuss regarding the poetry right now. If that's incorrect, then pop a message into chat and I will go back and address that. Pride and Prejudice. Now, I will attempt to recap everything that's happened so far, although I am very conscious of the fact that now that we're just starting chapter 21, there is actually a lot to recap. There we go. So, as briefly as I can. In chapter 1, we were introduced to the Bennet family, who were Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, Jane, the eldest daughter, followed by Elizabeth, Mary, Catherine, also known as Kitty, and Lydia. We also learn that a Mr. Bingley was moving into a nearby house, Netherfield Mansion. In chapter 2, we learn a bit about Mr. Bennet's sense of humour. In those days, the only way for two families to be properly introduced to each other and begin some form of relationship was for the most senior men of the two households to meet and be introduced to each other. With both the daughters of the Bennet household and their mother were hoping that that one of the daughters might be able to marry Mr. Bingley, though they wished to meet him to judge how reasonable that would be, because they were of an age where they were looking for partners. Now, Mr. Bennet's sense of humour comes into it because he, after being asked by his wife and daughters to visit Mr. Bingley at his earliest opportunity, he does so but doesn't tell them that he's done so. In chapter 3, we see more of Mr. Bennet's sense of humour, as it has now become known that he has visited Mr. Bingley, and therefore that the families have a existing relationship, but he refuses to provide an adequate description of Mr. Bingley to his wife or daughters. Later on in the chapter, a ball is held in which we meet the Hurst family, which is Mr. Hurst and Mr. Hurst and Mrs. Hurst. Mrs. Hurst is one of Mr. Bingley's sisters. And we also meet a Mr. Darcy, who is sitting out, who is rather unsociably sitting out from the dancing, which causes there not to be enough partners, so Elizabeth ends up sitting out as a result of his sitting out. And when Mr. Bingley approaches Mr. Darcy about this, I should point out, if I hadn't before, Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley are good friends. When Mr. Bingley approaches Mr. Darcy about this and suggests that he dance with Elizabeth, he states that Elizabeth isn't attractive enough for his tastes, and that why should he dance with a woman who's clearly been slighted by another man because she's sitting out, which of course isn't what happened and is quite an awful slight. Overall, Mr. Darcy goes from being considered one of the most attractive men in the room to, by the entire room, being considered to be an arrogant and unpleasant individual. In chapter 4, we see Jane and Elizabeth talking about the difference in character between Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley. In chapter 5, we are introduced to the Lucases. The Lucases were in attendance at the aforementioned ball, but I don't believe they had been explicitly named until this point, and we find out that Charlotte Lucas is a very good friend of Elizabeth. In chapter 6, we find out that Mr. Darcy is falling in love with Elizabeth. In chapter 7, we find out that Catherine and Lydia are travelling to Mrs. Phillips, who is Mrs. Bennet's sister, in a village called Meryton, regularly, and gossip with her, and that while they're there they find out that there are some soldiers that have recently been stationed there. We also see that Jane travels to Netherfield Manor to see Mr. Bingley and the rest of the Bingley family, but she falls ill. This was because she ends up riding a horse through rain. This was partly of her mother's devising, because when she asked if she could use the family carriage, her mother refused in the hopes that she would fall ill and would then have to spend the several nights at Netherfield Manor, and a romance might blossom between her and Mr. Bingley. That was her mother's thinking. The following morning, Elizabeth walks to Netherfield Manor and ends up staying the night. In chapter 8, we find out that Elizabeth is being treated as an odd one out due to walking alone through fields to get there, which is considered very unwise, and because she prefers to read books instead of playing cards. We also learn a bit about Mr. Darcy's high standards in women, and it's agreed that Mr. Jones, the apotheker, will be called for the next morning to check up on Jane, who's not doing much better. The following morning, Mrs. Bennet also decides to visit Jane. She believes that Jane is in no danger, but claims that she should not be moved because she is too ill. This is because she wants to... her plan to have her and Mr. Bingley... This is to further her plan to have her and Mr. Bingley fall in love. The apotheker arrives, and he agrees that she shouldn't be moved. We see discussions between the guests and the hosts in which Lydia pressures Mr. Bingley in keeping a promise to hold a ball at Netherfield Manor in the near future. Lydia is hoping to meet some of the local soldiery there. In chapter 10, we see that Jane is on the mend, and we see the difference between Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy stressed again via an analogy of letter writing. Darcy makes an attempt to dance with Elizabeth, as he's falling in love with her, which is refused, and finally, whilst going for a walk with Mrs. Hurst, Elizabeth bumps into Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy, Miss Bingley and Mr. Darcy, I should say, and they end up forming a group of 3 with Elizabeth being left out. In chapter 11, we find out Jane is much recovered. Miss Bingley tries to persuade Mr. Bingley not to hold the ball, but fails. Miss Bingley tries to catch Mr. Darcy's attention via a turn about the room and ropes Elizabeth in to join her. This fails. In chapter 12, Elizabeth writes to her mother asking for the carriage so they can go home, but is refused. Ultimately, the Bingleys reluctantly agree to provide them with their carriage. I say reluctantly, they want them to stay longer due to Jane's health, although she is in the mend. They reluctantly agree to let them use their carriage the following morning. In chapter 13, a gentleman is visiting the Bennets, Mr. Collins, who it turns out is the cousin of Mr. Bennet, and in fact this cousin, Mr. Collins, is to inherit their house when the father dies, not his wife and children. We also find out that he's been ordained, so he is a priest, and that he is a patron in Miss Lady Catherine de Bourgh. In chapter 14, at dinner, we learn that Mr. Collins lives near his patroness and that she has a sickly daughter. We also learn that Mr. Bennet thinks Mr. Collins absurd, and we also learn that Mr. Collins never reads novels, and that there is an incident in which he feels offended by Lydia interrupting him when he's 3 pages into reading a book of Thorndyce's sermons. So that tells us a bit of Mr. Collins' character. In chapter 15, Mr. Collins, it's revealed that Mr. Collins intends to marry one of the Bennet daughters. This, in his view, will both provide him with a companion, but will also solve the issue of the inheritance, which had up till now been a sore point between the 2 halves of the family. Mrs. Bennet convinces him to change his mind from Jane to Elizabeth because she believes Jane is soon to be married to Mr. Bingley. Mr. Bennet insists that Mr. Collins joins the daughters in a trip to Meryton to be rid of him. There we see Mr. Denny and Mr. Wickham meet the party, who are officers in the army. Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley seem a bit off with Mr. Wickham when they too also arrive by chance and see the group. Mr. Wickham is invited to dinner at Mrs. Phillips the following evening. Mrs. Phillips being the sister of Mrs. Bennet, previously mentioned. In chapter 16, Mr. Wickham explains that the late Mr. Darcy was his godfather and bequeathed him the next presentation of the best living, presumably meaning a parish. The young Mr. Darcy denied it. We also learned that Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Lady Anne Darcy are sisters, and it is believed that Mr. Darcy will marry Miss de Bourgh to combine the 2 families' estates. In chapter 17, Jane cannot believe Mr. Darcy could be so unworthy of Mr. Bingley's regard in denying him something which he was promised in Mr. Darcy's late father's will, and tries to be diplomatic about the whole thing. Mr. Bingley's sisters come to visit the Bennet family to give their personal invitation for the long-expected ball at Netherfield. Everybody but Jane are largely ignored. I should point out that Mr. Bingley and Jane do seem to have some admiration for each other, and the rest of the Bingley family seem to ignore the rest of the Bennet family. Elizabeth discovers that Mr. Collins will also accept the invitation, and moreover asks for the first 2 dances, which she cannot reasonably refuse, even though she wanted to dance with Mr. Wickham for the first 2 dances. Mr. Wickham is not in chapter 18, Mr. Wickham is not present at the ball as he has gone to town on business and seems to have lingered. It is implied that this is due to Mr. Darcy's presence. Elizabeth detests the first two dances with Mr. Collins, as he is awkward and solemn. Then she accidentally accepts a dance with Mr. Darcy, leading to a little verbal sword play, followed by long periods of silence. Miss Bingley accosts Elizabeth over Mr. Wickham. Gossiping with Jane reveals the possibility that Mr. Wickham's inheritance was only conditional. Mr. Collins obliviously embarrasses himself in front of Mr. Darcy, contrary to Elizabeth's entreaties. Several members of the family then embarrass themselves, including Mrs. Bennet's loud gossiping and Mary's singing. By a manoeuvre of Mrs. Bennet, the family had to wait an additional 15 minutes for their carriage to arrive before they could leave. In chapter 19, Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth, who naturally refuses. Mr. Collins refuses to consider that the rejection is genuine, thinking instead that it is a feminine affectation. In chapter 20, Mrs. Bennet expresses that she is unhappy with Elizabeth's refusal, pointing out the dangers of spinsterhood, and makes some ever so melodramatic statements. Mr. Bennet sides with Elizabeth. Mr. Collins finally withdraws his pretensions to Elizabeth's favour and apologises. Yes, there has been a lot going on in this story so far, Mindful. I'm not sure what I'm going to do. I feel like I should be doing a recap at the start of each reading, but it is becoming so cumbersome at this point. Not only does it take me a long time to get through it all, but I'm starting to wonder if someone new listening could even take it all in. Yes. Mr. Collins doesn't... he's certainly a unique character, isn't he? Yeah, you might be right, Mindful. Anyway, I should probably begin. Since I'll be reading this, I won't be checking chat as often, but I will check it and answer periodically. So, chapter 21. The discussion of Mr. Collins' offer was now nearly at an end, and Elizabeth had only to suffer from the uncomfortable feelings necessarily attending it, and occasionally from some peevish illusions of her mother. I am actually going to check a couple of those words up. No, I do want Wiktionary, don't I? Peevish. Characterized by exhibiting petty bad temper, bad-tempered, moody, cross. Constantly complaining, whining, childishly fretful. That certainly does seem like an apt description of her mother's behaviour in this matter. So, once again, the discussion of Mr. Collins' offer was now nearly at an end, and Elizabeth had only to suffer from the uncomfortable feelings necessarily attending it, and occasionally from some peevish illusions of her mother. As for the gentleman himself, his feelings were chiefly expressed not by embarrassment or dejection, or by trying to avoid her, but by stiffness of manner and resentful silence. He scarcely ever spoke to her, and the assiduous attentions which he had been so sensible of himself were transferred for the rest of the day to Miss Lucas, whose civility in listening to him was a seasonable relief to them all, and especially to her friend. The morrow produced no abatement of Mrs. Bennet's ill humour or ill health. Mr. Collins was also in the same state of angry pride. Elizabeth had hoped that his resentment might shorten his visit, but his plan did not appear in the least affected by it. It was always to have He was always to have gone on Saturday, and to Saturday he meant to stay. After breakfast, the girls walked to Meryton to inquire if Mr. Wickham were returned, and to lament over his absence from the Netherfield ball. He joined them on their entering the town, and attended them to their aunt's, where his regret and vexation, and concern of everybody, was well talked over. To Elizabeth, however, he voluntarily acknowledged that the necessity of his absence had been self-imposed. I found, said he, as the time drew near, that I had better not meet Mr. Darcy, that to be in the same room, the same party with him for so many hours together might be more than I could bear, and that scenes might arise unpleasant to more than myself. She highly approved his forbearance, and they had leisure for a full discussion of it, and for all the commendation which they civilly bestowed on each other. As Wickham and another officer walked back with them to Longbourn, and during the walk he particularly attended to her. His accompanying them was a double advantage. She felt all the compliment it offered to herself, and it was most acceptable. It was most acceptable as an occasion of introducing him to her father and mother. Soon after their return, a letter was delivered to Miss Bennet. It came from Netherfield. The envelope contained a sheet of elegant little hot-pressed paper, well covered with a lady's fair, flowing hand, and Elizabeth saw her sister's countenance change as she read it, and saw her dwelling intently on some particular passages. Jane recollected herself soon, and, putting the letter away, tried to join with her usual cheerfulness in the general conversation, but Elizabeth felt an anxiety on the subject which drew off her attention, even from Wickham. And no sooner had he and his companion taken leave than a glance from Jane invited her to follow her upstairs. When they had gained their own room, Jane, taking out the letter, said, "This is from Caroline Bingley. What it contains has surprised me a good deal. The whole party have left Netherfield by this time, and are on their way to town, and without any intention of coming back again. You shall hear what she says." She then read the first sentence aloud, which comprised the information of their having just resolved to follow their brother to town directly, and of their meaning to dine in Grosvenor Street, where Mr. Hurst had a house. The next was in these words: "I do not pretend to regret anything I shall leave in Hertfordshire except your society, my dear friend, but we will hope at some future period to enjoy many returns of that delightful intercourse we have known, and in the meanwhile may lessen the pain of separation by a very frequent and most unreserved correspondence. I depend on you for that." To these high-flown expressions Elizabeth listened with all the insensibility of distrust, and though the suddenness of their removal surprised her, she saw nothing in it really to lament. It was not to be supposed that their absence from Netherfield would prevent Mr. Bingley's being there, and as to the loss of their society, she was persuaded that Jane must cease to regard it in the enjoyment of his. "It is unlucky," said she, after a short pause, "that you should not be able to see your friends before they leave the country. But may we not hope that the period of future happiness to which Miss Bingley looks forward may arrive earlier than she is aware, and that the delightful intercourse you have known as friends will be renewed with yet greater satisfaction as sisters? Mr. Bingley will not be detained in London by them. Caroline decidedly says that none of the party will return into Hertfordshire this winter. I will read it to you. When my brother left us yesterday, he imagined that the business which took him to London might be concluded in 3 or 4 days, but as we are certain it cannot be so, and at the same time convinced that when Charles gets to town he will be in no hurry to leave it again, we have determined on following him thither, and he may not be obliged to spend his vacant hours in a comfortless hotel. Many of my acquaintances are already there for the winter. I wish that I could hear that you, my dearest friend, had any intention of making one of the crowd, but of that I despair. I sincerely hope your Christmas in Hertfordshire may abound in the gaieties which that season generally brings, and that your beaux will be so numerous as to prevent your feeling the loss of the 3 of whom we shall have deprived you. and that your bow will be so numerous as to prevent your feeling the loss of 3 of whom we shall deprive you. I think I said it wrong again, but I shall proceed. It is evident by this, added Jane, that he comes back no more this winter. It is only evident that Miss Bingley does not mean that he should. Why will you think so? It must be his own doing. He is his own master, but you do not know all. I will read you the passage which particularly hurts me. I'll have no reserves from you. Mr. Darcy is impatient to see his sister, and to confess the truth, we are scarcely less eager to meet her again. I really do think Georgina Darcy has her equal for beauty, elegance and accomplishments. I really do not think Georgina Darcy has her equal for beauty, elegance and accomplishments, and that the affection she inspires in Louisa and myself is heightened into something still more interesting, from the hope we dare entertain of her being hereafter our sister. I do not know whether I ever before mentioned to you my feelings on this subject, but I will not leave the country without confiding them, and I trust you will not esteem them unreasonable. My brother admires her greatly already. He will have frequent opportunity now of seeing her on the most intimate footing. Her relations all wish the connections as much as his own, and her sister's partiality is not misleading me. I think, when I call Charles most capable of engaging any woman's heart, with all these circumstances to favour an attachment, and nothing to prevent it, am I wrong, my dearest Jane, in indulging the hope of an event which will secure the happiness of so many? What do you think of this sentence, my dear Lizzie? Said Jane as she finished it. Is it not clear enough? Does it not expressly declare that Caroline neither expects nor wishes me to be her sister, that she is perfectly convinced of her brother's indifference, and that if she suspects the nature of my feelings for him, she means most kindly to put me on my guard? Can there be any other opinion on the subject? Yes, I can, for mine is totally different. Will you hear it? Most willingly. You shall have it in a few words. Miss Bingley sees that her brother is in love with you, and wants him to marry Miss Darcy. She follows him to town in hope of keeping him there, and she tries to persuade you that he does not care about you. Jane shook her head. Indeed, Jane, you ought to believe me. No one has ever seen you together can doubt his affection. No one who has ever seen you together can doubt his affection. Miss Bingley, I am sure, cannot. She is not such a simpleton. Could she have seen half as much love in Mr. Darcy for herself, she would have ordered her wedding clothes. But the case is this: we are not rich enough or grand enough for them, and she is the more anxious to get Miss Darcy for her brother from the notion that when there has been one intermarriage, she may have less trouble in achieving a second, in which there is certainly some ingenuity, and I dare say it would succeed if Mr. Burr were out of the way. But, my dearest Jane, you cannot seriously imagine that because Miss Bingley tells you her brother greatly admires Miss Darcy, he is in the smallest degree less sensible of your merit than when he took leave of you on Tuesday, or that it will be in her power to persuade him that, instead of being in love with you, he is very much in love with her friend. If we thought alike of Miss Bingley, replied Jane, your representation of all this might make me quite easy. But I know the foundation is unjust. Caroline is incapable of wilfully deceiving anyone, and all that I can hope in this case is that she is deceiving herself. That is right. You could not have started a more happy idea, since you will not take comfort in mine. Believe her to be deceived by all means. You have now done your duty by her, and must fret no longer. But my dear sister, can I be happy, even supposing the best in accepting a man whose sisters and friends are all wishing him to marry elsewhere? You must decide for yourself, said Elizabeth, and if, upon mature deliberation, you find that the misery of disobliging his 2 sisters is more than equivalent to the happiness of being his wife, I advise you by all means to refuse him. How can you talk so, said Jane, faintly smiling. You must know that though I should be exceedingly grieved at their disapprobation, I could not hesitate. I do not think you would, and that being the case, I cannot consider your situation with much compassion. But if he returns no more this winter, my choice will never be required. 1,000 things may arise in 6 months. The idea of his returning no more, Elizabeth, treated with the utmost contempt. The idea of his returning no more, Elizabeth treated with the utmost contempt. It appeared to be to her merely the suggestion of Caroline's interested wishes, and she could not for a moment suppose that those wishes, however openly or artfully spoken, could influence a young man so totally independent of everyone. She represented to her sister as forcefully as possible that she felt what she felt on the subject, and had soon the pleasure of seeing its happy effect. Jane's temper was not desponding, and she was gradually led to hope, though the diffidence of affection sometimes overcame the hope, that Bingley would return to Netherfield and answer every wish of her heart. They agreed that Mrs. Bennet should only hear of the departure of the family without being alarmed on the score of the gentleman's conduct, but even this partial communication gave her a great deal of concern, and she bewailed it as exceedingly unlucky that the ladies should happen to go away just as they were all getting so intimate together. After lamenting it, however, at some length, she had the consolation that Mr. Bingley would be soon down again and soon dining at Longbourn, and the conclusion of all was that the comfortable declaration that though he had been invited only to a family dinner, she would take care to have 2 full courses. So, Chapter 22. The Bennets were engaged to dine with the Lucases, and again during the chief of the day was Miss Lucas so kind as to listen to Mr. Collins. Elizabeth took an opportunity of thanking her. "It keeps him in good humour," said she, "and I am more obliged to you than I can express." Charlotte assured her friend of her satisfaction in being useful, and that I amply repaid her for the little sacrifice of her time. This was very amiable, but Charlotte's kindness extended farther than Elizabeth had any conception of. Its object was nothing else than to secure her from any return of Mr. Collins' addresses, by engaging them towards herself. Such was... So in other words, Charlotte is trying to get Mr. Collins to be interested in her to save Elizabeth from any further advances from Mr. Collins, as I understand it. Such was Miss Lucas's scheme, and appearances were so favourable that when they parted at night she would have felt almost secure of success if he had not been to leave Hertfordshire so very soon. But here she did injustice to the fire and independence of his character, for it led him to escape out of Longbourn House the next morning with admirable slyness, and hastened to Lucas Lodge to throw himself at her feet. He was so anxious to avoid the notice of his cousins, from a conviction that if they saw him depart, they could not fail to conjecture his design, that he was not willing to have the attempt known till its success might be known likewise. For though feeling almost secure, and with reason, for Charlotte had been tolerably encouraging, his comparatively diffident for Charlotte had been tolerably encouraging, he was comparatively diffident since the adventures of Wednesday. His reception, however, was of the most flattering kind. Miss Lucas perceived him from an upper window as he walked towards the house, and instantly set out to meet him accidentally in the lane. But little had she dared to hope that so much love and eloquence awaited her there. In as short a time as Mr. Collins' long speeches would allow, everything was settled between them to the satisfaction of both, and as they entered the house he earnestly entreated her to name the day that was to make him the happiest of men, and though such solicitation must be waived for the present, the lady felt no inclination to trifle with his happiness. The stupidity with which he was favoured by nature must guard his courtship from any charm that could make a woman wish for its continuance, and Miss Lucas, who accepted him solely from the pure and disinterested desire of an establishment, cared not how soon that establishment were gained. Sir William and Lady Lucas were speedily applied to for their consent, and it was bestowed with a most joyful alacrity. Mr. Collins' present circumstances made it a most eligible match for their daughter, to whom they could give little fortune, and his prospects of future wealth were exceedingly fair. Lady Lucas began directly to calculate, with more interest than the matter had ever excited before, how many years longer Mr. Bennet was likely to live, and Sir William gave it as his decided opinion that whenever Mr. Collins should be in possession of the Longbourn estate, it would be highly expedient that both he and his wife should make their appearance at St. James. The whole family, in short, were properly overjoyed on the occasion. The younger girls formed hopes of coming out a year or two sooner than they might otherwise have done, and the boys were relieved from their apprehension of Charlotte's dying an old maid. Charlotte herself was tolerably composed. She had gained her point, and had time to consider of it. Her reflections were in general satisfactory. Mr. Collins, to be sure, was neither sensible nor agreeable. His society was irksome, and his attachment to her must be imaginary, but still he would be her husband. Without thinking highly either of men or matrimony, marriage had always been her object. It was the only provision for well-educated young women of small fortune, and however uncertain of giving happiness, must be their pleasantest preservative from want. This preservative she had now obtained, and at the age of 27, without having ever been handsome, she felt all the good luck of it. The least agreeable circumstance in the business was the surprise it must occasion to Elizabeth Bennet, whose friendship she valued beyond that of any other person. Elizabeth would wonder, and probably would blame her, and though her resolution was not to be shaken, her feelings must be hurt by such a disapprobation. She resolved to give her the information herself, and therefore charged Mr. Collins, when he returned to Longbourn to dinner, to drop no hint of what had passed before any of the family. A promise of secrecy was of course very dutifully given, but it could not be kept without difficulty, for the curiosity excited by his long absence burst forth in such very direct questions on his return as required some ingenuity to evade. He was at the same time exercising great self-denial, for he was longing to publish his prosperous love. As he was to begin his journey too early on the morrow to see any of the family, the ceremony of leave-taking was performed when the ladies moved for the night, and Mrs. Bennet, with great politeness and cordiality, said how happy they should be to see him at Longbourn again whenever his engagements might allow him to visit them. "My dear madam," he replied, "this invitation is particularly gratifying, because it is what I have been hoping to receive, and you may be very certain that I shall avail myself of it as soon as possible." They were all astonished, and Mr. Bennet, who could by no means wish for so speedy a return, immediately said, "But there is not danger of Lady Catherine's disapprobation here, my good sir. You had better neglect your relations than run the risk of offending your patroness." "My dear sir," replied Mr. Collins, "I am particularly obliged to you for this friendly caution, and you may depend upon my not taking so material a step without her ladyship's concurrence. You cannot be too much upon your guard, risk anything rather than her displeasure, and if you find it likely to be raised by your coming to us again, which I should think exceedingly probable, stay quietly at home, and be satisfied that we shall take no offence. Believe me, my dear sir, my gratitude is warmly excited by such affectionate attention, and depend upon it, you will speedily receive from me a letter of thanks for this, and for every other mark of your regard during my stay in Hertfordshire. As for my fair cousins, though my absence may not be long enough to render it necessary, I shall now take the liberty of wishing them health and happiness, not excepting my cousin Elizabeth." With proper civilities the ladies then withdrew, and all of them equally surprised that he meditated a quick return. Mrs. Bennet wished to understand by it that he thought of paying his addresses to one of her younger girls, and Mary might have been prevailed on to accept him. She rated his abilities much higher than any of the others. There was a solidity in his reflections which often struck her, and though by no means so clever as herself, she thought that if encouraged to read and improve himself by such an example as hers, he might become a very agreeable companion. But on the following morning, every hope of this kind was done away. Miss Lucas called soon after breakfast, and in a private conference with Elizabeth related the event of the day before. The possibility of Mr. Collins fancying himself in love with her friend had once occurred to Elizabeth within the last day or two. But that Charlotte could encourage him seemed almost as far from possibility as she could encourage him herself, and her astonishment was consequently so great as to overcome at first the bounds of decorum, and she could not help crying out, "Engaged to Mr. Collins, my dear Charlotte? Impossible!" The steady countenance which Miss Lucas had commanded in telling her story gave way to momentary confusion here on receiving so direct a reproach, though, as it was no more than she expected, she soon regained her composure and calmly replied, "Why should you be surprised, my dear Eliza? Do you think it incredible that Mr. Collins should be able to procure any woman's good opinion, because he was not so happy as to succeed with you?" But Elizabeth had not recollected herself. But Elizabeth had now recollected herself, and making a strong effort for it, was able to assure with tolerable firmness that the prospect of their relationship was highly grateful to her, and that she wished her all the imaginable happiness. "I see what you are feeling," replied Charlotte. "You must be surprised, very surprised, so lately as Mr. Collins was wishing to marry you. But when you have had time to think it over, I hope you'll be satisfied with what I have done. I am not romantic, you know. I never was. I ask only a comfortable home, and considering Mr. Collins' character, connection, and situation in life, I am convinced that my chance of happiness with him is as fair as most people can boast on entering the marriage state." Elizabeth quietly answered, "Undoubtedly," and after an awkward pause they returned to the rest of the family. Charlotte did not stay much longer, and Elizabeth was then left to reflect on what she had heard. It was a long time before she became at all reconciled to the idea of so unsuitable a match. The strangeness of Mr. Collins making 2 offers of marriage within 3 days was nothing in comparison of his being now accepted. She had always felt that Charlotte's opinion of matrimony was not exactly like her own, but she had not supposed it to be possible that, when called into action, she would have sacrificed every better feeling to worldly advantage. Charlotte, the wife of Mr. Collins, was a most humiliating picture, and to the pang of a friend disgracing herself and sunk in her esteem, was added the distressing conviction that it was impossible for that friend to be tolerably happy in the lot she had chosen. Mindful says, "I adore Elizabeth. She's such a cool, interesting woman. Every time she asserts herself or plays against others' games, I'm thoroughly taken with her." Yeah, she does seem a very sensible and interesting character, doesn't she? So, I think that will conclude Pride and Prejudice for this week, and so we will finish off with some riddles. As usual, we will begin with the riddle we finished on last week, and then we will move on to the following riddles. So we finished, I believe, on 52. 4 men once sat down in a tavern to play. They played all the night and part of the day. Oh, hold on. There we go. 4 men once sat in a tavern to play. They played all the night and part of the day. Though none of them betted, no stake was put down. Each found when he rose he was a winner a crown. He was winner a crown. And the solution to that one was that they were all musicians. So, 53. Kitty, a fair but frozen maid, kindled a flame I yet deplore. The hoodwinked boy I call to aid, though of his near approach afraid, so fatal to my suit before. At length, propitious to my prayer, the little urchin willing came. From earth I saw him mount in air, and soon he'd cured with dexterous care the bitter relics of my flame. Say by what title or what name I shall this busy youth address. Cupid and he are not the same, though both can raise or quench a flame. I'm sure 'twill please you if you guess. Goodness. This is a difficult one. I will read it once more, I think. Kitty, a fair but frozen maid, kindled a flame I yet deplore. The hoodwinked boy I call to aid, though of his near approach afraid, so fatal to my suit before, at length propitious to my prayer, the little urchin willing came. From earth I saw him mount in air, and soon he'd cured with dexterous care the bitter relics of my flame. Say by what title or what name I shall this busy youth address, Cupid and he are not the same, though both can raise or quench a flame. I'm sure 'twill please you if you guess. Yes, Jenny, I think I interpret the last bit as indicating that the subject of the riddle is something positive, something that people would like. So I think we can rule out the answer being something like death or the Grim Reaper. I think flame is probably being used metaphorically here. I think flame is being used to denote an emotion. I could be wrong, but I think that's what it's doing. Now, you would talk about a romantic flame, but because they specifically say that this individual isn't Cupid, I'm assuming it's another emotion, so possibly anger? Also talks about bitter relics of my flame. So again, that makes me think that it's probably a very negative emotion like anger or envy or something like that. Jenny says, I don't think it's anger because of the please in the end. Now, I think the urchin that whose name is the solution to this riddle, I believe they are the cure for the emotion, assuming it is an emotion, that is being denoted by the flame. So even if the flame itself were anger, which would be seen as negative, the urchin would be a positive thing. So if it was, I don't know, forgiveness or something like that, then that would figure. Although because they referred to Cupid, I wonder if they're looking for something more definite than just forgiveness. I feel like it's probably something along those lines, though. Something like forgiveness. I'm sorry to hear that, Mindful. We're just trying to solve this riddle. I do think it's something like forgiveness, but I think there's a better word for it. That's assuming that I'm right in how I've interpreted everything else. I could be well off. I'm gonna look up the answer at this point. We can't delay the stream too much. I'm sure there's... I think it's something like forgiveness, but I'm sure there's a better word for it. So what was it? 53, I think? Oops, I went too far. Sorry. A chimney sweeper? Okay, I was very far off. Welcome back, Mindful. What page was I on? So, the answer was a chimney sweeper. Kitty, a fair but frozen maid, kindled a flame I yet deplore. The hoodwinked boy I call to aid, though of his near approach afraid, so fatal to my suit before, at length precipitous to my prayer, the little urchin willing came, from earth I saw him mount in air, and soon he cured with dexterous care the bitter relics of my flame. Say what title or what name I shall this busy youth address. Cupid and he are not the same, they both can raise or quench a flame. I'm sure 'twill please you if you guess. Well, I understand the Kitty, a fair but frozen maid, kindled a flame I yet deplore. That makes sense. But I don't fully understand the rest of the poem. But there's the poem, the riddle, the rest of the riddle. But I mean, we don't have chimney sweeps anymore because we don't like those sort of fires. So perhaps there's some sort of knowledge there that I'm missing. Okay, let's try 54. Proud, noble, generous, handsome, free, few are so much caressed as me. The statesman, wit, the prince and peer, full often in my train appear. Like a first minister of state, they my important fiat wait, my will and pleasure oft their fate. I thousands give, and in an hour can take away, such is my power. But though thus by great carest, I'm by the lowest oft oppressed, a wretch who is not worth a scuse, can what he pleases make me do, and in his hands I'm oft a tool, to make the wisest man a fool. For even Fox, with all his wit, has through my means, 'tis said, been bit. Life's sad vicissitudes, I know, am sometimes high and sometimes low. In early youth of I'm not sure what that is. In early youth of servants I have many, I think. Is that servants? Yet before I die, a servant do myself become, to menial slaves such is my doom. Yet, spite of my degraded fate, I still can service do the state, the thoughts of senators convey, or take its enemies away. The swain who would his mistress see, is oftentimes obliged to me. Physicians oft my service claim, and in subtle lawyers do the same. But this is when I'm lost my fame, once pride of Britain and of Rome, I'm now neglected die, unhonoured by a tomb. Ah. Another tricky one. I should point out, I mean, they're often hard, Mindful, but they're not usually this hard. I'm wondering if the answer's something like, oh, what's the word? Is it oratory? I feel like that's not right. The skill of speaking. That is right, oratory. I mean, it would be... Oh, wait. Is it? Yes. The art of public speaking. Although that would be quite a... that would be quite a cynical view to take. That the skill of the orator had been lost by this point. Although for even Fox with all his wit, through my means to said been bit, that wouldn't figure with oratory unless this was a metaphorical fox. Vicissitudes. Regular change or succession from one thing to another, or one part of a cycle to the next. Alteration, mutual succession, interchange. A change, especially one's life or fortunes. I'm guessing oratory. It doesn't figure with all of it, but it figures with most of it. Certainly the lines, the swain who would his mistress see is oftentimes obliged to me, physicians oft my service claim, and subtle lawyers do the same, but this is when I've lost my fame, once pride of Britain and of Rome, I now neglected die unhonoured by a tomb. All that would figure with oratory if they were being quite cynical. Would anyone else like to make any guesses before I look up the answer? Okay, so the answer is a racehorse. Goodness. Not going well for me tonight, is it? Proud, noble, generous, handsome, free, few are so much caressed as me. The statesman, wit, the prince and peer, full often in my train appear. That was a clue that I missed. Like a first minister of state, they my important fiat wait. Fiat, I should have double checked that. An arbitrary authoritative command or order to do something. My will and pleasure oft their fate, I thousands given in an hour can take away, such is my power. I don't follow that. Oh, because they're betting. But though thus by the great carest, I'm by the lowest oft oppressed, a wretch who is not worth a scuss can what he pleases make me do, and in his hands I'm oft a tool to make the wisest man a fool, for even fox with all his wit, through my means 'tis said been bit. Life's sad vicissitudes I know, am sometimes high, am sometimes low. In early youth of servants I have many, yet before I die a servant do myself become, to menial slaves, such is my doom. Yet, spite of my degraded fate, I still can service do the state. The thoughts of senators convey, or take its enemies away. The swain who would his mistress see is oftentimes obliged to me. Physicians often my service claim, and subtle lawyers do the same. Okay, well that's misleading. That's true, but this is when I've lost my fame. Oh. And they've got that little mark there to tell us that these three lines go together. Interesting. Once pride of Britain and of Rome, I now neglected, unhonoured by a tomb. Huh. It kind of makes sense in retrospect. Let's try another and hope it's not as difficult as the last two. 55. I'm rough, I'm smooth, I'm wet, I'm dry. My station low, my title high. The king my lawful master is, but I'm used by all, though only his. Oh dear, Jenny. I'm rough, I'm smooth, I'm wet, I'm dry, my station low, my title high. The king my lawful master is, I'm used by all though only his. A toothbrush. If it's a physical thing, then I suspect it's some sort of tool or natural resource that was traditionally the property of the reigning monarch only. Yes, it's the last line that I think is probably the biggest hint. I'm just not sure what it's hinting at. See, there are things that traditionally belong to the monarch. For example, I think it was the case that, for example, all land was notionally belonged to the monarch, but at the monarch's discretion, people were allowed to live on it and therefore sort of own it under the monarch. And that would figure with used by all though only his. But I don't think that's the answer to this one. But it might be something of that ilk. Sorry to hear that, Mindful. I'm probably going to finish on this riddle, but I want to really try quite hard since this will be the last one. My station low, my title high. That is really... That's the one I find most confusing. Tell you what, I'll look this one up and then we will try one more. I don't think I'm going to get it in a sensible period of time. Yes, I thought of the possibility of being related to shaving. The issue there is I don't see how anything related to shaving would be specifically the property of the king. Where were we? Was that 54? No, 55. Highway. Of course it would be. I feel so foolish now. Because it's like what I was describing with land. The same would be true of the highway, as in the King's Highway. I'm rough, I'm smooth, I'm wet, I'm dry. That could be true of a highway. My station low, my title high. Highway. The king my lawful master is, used by all but though only his. It's so obvious in retrospect. Okay, one more. Okay. Before creating nature willed, that atoms into form should rear. By me the boundless space was filled, on me was built the first made star. For me a saint will break his word, by the proud atheist I'm adored. At me the coward draws his sword, and by the hero I am feared. Scorned by the meek and humble mind, yet often by the vain possessed. Heard by the deaf, seen by the blind, I'm to the troubled conscience rest. Than wisdom's sacred self I'm wiser, though yet by every blockhead known. I'm freely given by the miser, kept by the prodigal alone. The king, God bless him, as 'tis said, by me is put into a passion, yet even him I can persuade to act against his inclination. As vice deformed, as virtue fair, the courtier's loss, the patriot's gains, the poet's wealth, the coxcomb's care. Read and you have it for your pains. What is a coxcomb? The cap of a court jester, adorned with red stripes. The flesh, red pate of a rooster, a foolish or conceited person, a dandy. Probably mean it in the last sense. Nothingness, mindless things. Sorry, I apologise. Not mindfulness things. Before creating nature willed, the atoms into form should rear. By me the boundless space was filled. On me was built the first made star. For me a saint will break his word. By the proud atheist I'm adored. At me the coward draws his sword. And by the hero I am feared. Scorned by the meek and humble mind, yet often by the vain possessed. Heard by the deaf, seen by the blind. I'm to the troubled conscience rest. Than wisdom's sacred self I'm wiser. Though yet by every blockhead known, I'm freely given by the miser, kept by the prodigal alone. The king, God bless him, as 'tis said, by me is put into a passion. Yet even him I can persuade to act against his inclination. As vice deformed, as virtue fair, the courtier's loss, the patriot's gain. The poet's wealth, the coxcomb's care. Read and you have it for your pains. I think you're right. I think it's nothing. Mindfulness said it's probably chimney sweep again. Nothing. Well done, mindfulness. That was very well figured out. Okay, so that concludes this stream. Thank you for coming, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. Jenny said the answer is nothing. So much is written and the answer is nothing. So yeah, that concludes today's stream. Thank you for coming. If you have any comments or feedback regarding the stream, I'd love to hear them. It was lovely having you here, Mindfulness. I will be streaming again on Friday with some more Pokemon Crystal, and probably Saturday as well. Then Monday it will be back to my Monkey Island free stream. Looks like we're getting towards the end of that game. And then Wednesday it'll be back to my poetry, prose, and riddles stream once again. I think we will raid Tofu Bunny, because I believe she is doing some Super Mario Galaxy and she is a lovely person. So, once again, thank you for coming, and I hope you have a wonderful night.